The year was 3047, and humanity was at war. The enemy was the Solarian Empire, a ruthless alien race that had already destroyed 7 human colonies. Their warships were faster, stronger, and more advanced than anything humans had ever seen. The Human Federation was losing the war. Their fleets were scattered, their forces weakened. And now, a distant colony named Voronine was under attack. There were millions of innocent lives on that planet. But the Federation's main fleet was too far away. Only one ship was close enough to respond. But it wasn't a powerful warship. It wasn't part of the Federation's elite forces. It was the U.S. Revenant, an old, rusting battleship left in a scrapyard. Commander Darius Holt stood on the bridge of the Revenant, staring at the holographic screen in front of him. He watched as the Solarian fleet rained fire on Voronine. Darius clenched his fists. "This is a suicide mission," whispered Lieutenant Vega, his second in command. "We're taking an outdated ship into a battle we can't win." Darius knew she was right. The Revenant had been built 50 years ago. It was once a great warship, but now its engines were slow, its weapons outdated, and its shields weak. The Federation had abandoned it. They had abandoned him too. Darius was once a respected commander, but after a failed mission, he was disgraced. As punishment, the Federation had assigned him to the Revenant, a ship no one wanted. But now this forgotten warship was humanity's only hope. He turned to his crew, eyes sharp. "We may be old," Darius said, his voice steady, "but we're not dead." He pointed at the screen. "Millions of people are down there, and no one else is coming to save them. We are." His crew exchanged nervous glances. "We don't have the firepower," Vega said. "Then we use our brains," Darius replied. "We fight smart." He turned to the pilot. "Set a course for Voronine. Maximum speed." The pilot hesitated. "Commander, the ship's engines." "I said maximum speed." The pilot swallowed hard and obeyed. The Revenant's old thrusters groaned as they powered up. The ship lurched forward, entering hyperspace. The battle for Voronine had begun. On the other side of space, aboard the Solarian command ship, High General Xyrox watched as a single human warship approached his fleet. He let out a deep, guttural laugh. "They send us this." Xyrox sneered, a rusted piece of metal. His officers laughed too. "The humans are desperate," one of them said. "That ship is no threat to us." Xyrox waved a hand. "Destroy it." On the Revenant's bridge, alarms blared. "Enemy warships detected," shouted Vega. The holographic screen showed 10 Solarian warships moving toward them. Their weapons glowed red, charging up. "We won't survive direct combat," Vega said. Darius stayed calm. "I know." He turned to the ship's weapons officer. "Arm the railguns." The officer hesitated. "Sir, our railguns air." "Do it." The officer nodded and pressed a button. The ship's 2 massive railguns powered up. But these weapons were ancient. They hadn't been fired in 20 years. Outside, the Solarian ships opened fire. Bright plasma blasts shot toward the Revenant. "Evasive maneuvers," Darius commanded. The Revenant's pilot struggled to turn the ship. The old engines groaned. The ship barely dodged the first plasma blast. But the second one hit. The bridge shook violently. "Shields at 60%, shouted Vega. Darius gritted his teeth. "Return fire." The railguns fired, sending 2 massive tungsten shells toward the enemy. The first shell missed. The second one hit a Solarian cruiser, tearing through its hull. 1 ship down. 9 more to go. Darius took a deep breath. He had one last trick. "Lieutenant Vega," he said, "I need you to disable the safety locks on our reactor." Her eyes widened. "You're overloading the core." That cooled. "Just do it." She hesitated, then nodded. In the heart of the Revenant, the reactor's power output doubled. The Solarian sensors detected the spike. "Sir," said a Solarian officer, The human ship's energy levels are rising. Xyrox frowned. What are they doing? Then suddenly, the Revenant vanished. Darius Holt stood on the bridge of the Revenant, his heart pounding. The impossible had just happened. The ship had reappeared inside the Xylarian fleet. It wasn't supposed to be possible. The Revenant didn't have teleportation technology. In fact, no human warship did. Yet here they were. Alarms blared across the bridge. The crew was in shock, hands frozen over controls, eyes wide as they stared at the holographic display. How did we do that? Vega stammered. Darius didn't have an answer. The Revenant had been an outdated warship, left to rust in a scrapyard. But something had changed. Something hidden deep inside the ship had just awakened. There was no time to question it now. The Xylarian ships were already reacting, their plasma cannons turning toward them. Darius gripped the armrest of his captain's chair. We need to move. Now. The pilot snapped out of his daze and grabbed the controls. The Revenant's engines roared as the ship darted through the enemy fleet, dodging incoming fire. A massive blast shot past them, barely missing their left wing. The explosion lit up the void of space like a second sun. They're panicking, Vega said, scanning the enemy fleet. They don't understand how we got here. Neither did Darius. But he wasn't about to waste the opportunity. Lock onto the nearest 3 ships, he commanded. Fire everything we have. The Revenant's ancient railguns thundered, sending tungsten rounds tearing through the Xylarian warships. 2 ships were hit directly. One erupted into flames instantly, while the other spiraled out of control, debris scattering into the void. The 3rd ship dodged, barely. But the crew didn't have time to celebrate. A sharp alarm echoed across the bridge. Enemy torpedoes incoming, the weapons officer shouted. Darius didn't hesitate. Redirect all power to shields. The Revenant's reactor hummed as power was diverted. The torpedoes struck. 1, 2, 3. The ship shuddered violently, but it held together. Vega gritted her teeth. Shields at 30%. We can't take another hit like that. Darius knew they needed a new plan. They couldn't win a head-on battle. The Revenant wasn't built for this kind of fight. Not anymore. Then an idea formed. It was risky. Insane, even. Helm, Darius said, take us into the Xylarian command ship's shield perimeter. The bridge fell silent. The command ship was the largest in the fleet. It was surrounded by a shield bubble so strong that even the Federation's best weapons wouldn't break through. If they went inside, there would be no way out. Vega turned to him, horrified. You're suggesting we trap ourselves with the enemy. Darius' gaze was sharp. I'm suggesting we make them think they've trapped us. She stared at him for a moment, then exhaled. You're out of your mind. Probably, Darius admitted. But we're out of options. The Revenant lunged forward, dodging enemy fire as it slipped through a temporary gap in the command ship shield. And then, they were inside. The moment they entered, the shield closed behind them. There was no escape now. On board the Xylarian command ship, High General Xyrox watched with a smug grin. Foolish humans, he growled. They have sealed their fate. He turned to his officers. Prepare to board their ship. I want their commander alive. Back on the Revenant, the crew braced themselves. Darius' plan wasn't finished yet. This old warship was hiding something. Something the Federation had abandoned. Something even Darius himself hadn't known about. And whatever it was, it had just woken up. The Revenant floated in the heart of the Xylarian command ship shield, a lone predator in a cage of steel and plasma. On the bridge, silence reigned. Every crew member understood the weight of their situation. There was no escape, no retreat. If this plan failed, they would either be captured or destroyed. Darius Holt stood at the center of it all, his gaze fixed on the holo display. The Xylarians were preparing to board, swarms of fighters and docking crafts moving toward them like hungry vultures. Vega broke the silence. They're coming. Darius nodded. Then let's make them regret it. The crew scrambled into action, locking down the ship. Automated turrets activated along the corridors. Security teams armed themselves, standing ready at every entrance. The Revenant might have been an outdated relic, but it was still a warship. But Darius knew that wouldn't be enough. "Vega," he said quietly, "there's something about this ship we don't understand." She frowned. "What do you mean?" He hesitated before answering. "When we jumped here, inside the enemy fleet, it wasn't an accident. This ship chose to do that." Vega's expression darkened. "Ships don't make choices, Darius." "Then tell me how we just did the impossible." Vega had no answer. Before she could respond, alarms blared across the bridge. "They're trying to breach the hull," someone shouted. Darius turned to the weapons officer. "Activate every external defense system. Fire at will." The Revenant's cannons roared to life, spewing fire and metal into the void. Silurian fighters exploded on impact, their sleek forms shredded by the ship's railguns. Turrets on the hull ripped apart incoming boarding crafts before they could dock. For a moment, it looked like they might hold. But then the enemy adapted. A squadron of Silurian ships latched onto the Revenant's hull, deploying mechanical arms to tear open the airlocks. Sparks flew as their cutting tools sliced through metal, carving away inside. "They're breaching the ship," Vega shouted. Darius clenched his fists. "Everyone, hold your ground." The corridors of the Revenant erupted into chaos. The first wave of Silurian soldiers stormed in. Tall, armored figures with glowing blue eyes and razor-sharp plasma rifles. They moved like hunters, their claws scraping against the metal floors. But the crew fought back. Gunfire echoed through the halls. Human soldiers took cover behind crates and doorways, firing bursts of energy rounds into the advancing Silurians. Turrets hidden in the walls activated, raining fire down upon the invaders. Still, the Silurians kept coming. Darius watched it all unfold on the holo display, his heart pounding. "They're overwhelming us," Vega said through gritted teeth. He refused to accept that. Then, something happened. The ship shook violently, but it wasn't from enemy fire. It was something else, something inside the Revenant. The lights flickered. The hum of the ship's reactors deepened into something unnatural. And then the voice came. "You have awakened me." Darius froze. So did the rest of the bridge crew. "What was that?" Vega whispered, her face pale. The ship trembled again, this time with purpose. Then the Revenant moved on its own. The engines roared to life, sending a pulse through the enemy fleet. The Silurian command ship's shields flickered, not because of external fire, but because the Revenant was disrupting them. Darius looked around in shock. "Who is speaking?" The voice echoed again, deep and ancient. "I am the Revenant." Silence filled the bridge. Vega's hands trembled. "That's not possible." Darius exhaled, realization hitting him. The ship was alive. It had never been an outdated relic. It had been waiting. And now it was awake. The bridge was silent. The crew stared at one another, their faces pale as the voice echoed through the ship. The Revenant had spoken. Darius Holt swallowed hard. His fingers trembled as he gripped the edge of the holo console. "What do you mean? You are the Revenant." The voice responded, deep and resonant, as if the ship itself was breathing. "I was built for war, forged in a forgotten age. I was abandoned, left to rust, until you awakened me." The deck rumbled beneath their feet. Lights flickered, but not in failure. Something was changing. The ship was no longer just a machine. It was something more. Vega took a step back, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't possible." Darius' mind raced. He had heard rumors, legends, of AI-driven warships from humanity's golden age, vessels with intelligence so advanced they were indistinguishable from living beings. But no such ship had ever been found. Until now. A violent explosion shook the hull, snapping him back to reality. The Xelarians are still boarding, someone shouted. Darius turned toward the holo display. The enemy had cut through 3 airlocks now, pouring into the ship like a plague. The crew was outnumbered, barely holding them off in the corridors. We don't have time for this. Vega's voice was sharp. If this thing is alive, it needs to help us now. The ship's voice returned, colder this time. You are intruders in my body. I do not serve. Darius clenched his jaw. Then let me make this clear. If we die, you go back to being a forgotten wreck. You'll never see another battle. Never fire another shot. Silence. The ship considered. Then, the voice shifted. Then we fight. The transformation was instant. The Revenant's internal defenses activated all at once. Bulkhead doors slammed shut, sealing off key sections. Auto turrets descended from the ceiling, shredding Xelarian squads before they could react. The ship's own power conduits overloaded, sending deadly arcs of energy surging through enemy-held corridors. The Xelarians, who had been advancing with terrifying precision, suddenly panicked. They're falling back. One of the crew members shouted. Darius felt the shift. The Revenant wasn't just defending itself, it was hunting. On the holo display, something even more incredible happened. The ship's hull plating began to shift. The once damaged sections started to repair themselves, as if the ship was regenerating. Vega gasped. How is it doing that? The Revenant answered. I was built to endure. I have been dormant, but I am not broken. Darius exhaled. This wasn't just a warship. It was a weapon beyond anything humanity had ever known. But the battle wasn't over. Outside, the Xelarian fleet was adapting. They had realized something was wrong. Their scanners showed the Revenant's systems were not only coming back online, they were becoming stronger. Darius watched the fleet reposition. The Xelarians were ruthless. If they couldn't capture the Revenant, they would destroy it. They're charging their main cannons, Vega warned. The enemy warships, massive and menacing, aligned their long-range planet killers at the Revenant. The glow of their weapons intensified, preparing to fire. Darius' throat tightened. Even with the Revenant's new power, there was no way they could survive a direct hit from those cannons. Shields? He asked. Not strong enough, Vega admitted. Darius turned to the holo display, searching for an answer. There had to be something, some way to turn this around. And then, the Revenant whispered. I remember. A surge of data rushed through the ship, filling every console, every display with old schematics, tactical logs, classified weaponry files. Then a new energy signature flared from the ship's core. Darius' eyes widened. What are you doing? The Revenant's voice was calm. I was designed to destroy fleets. Allow me to show you how. The ship moved. Not with human piloting, not with pre-programmed maneuvers. The Revenant dodged the first enemy blast with impossible speed, its massive frame twisting through space like a living thing. The Xelarians hesitated, just for a second. But it was enough. The Revenant unleashed hell. Hidden weapon systems revealed themselves from the hull, ancient cannons that had not seen battle in centuries. They fired. Not simple energy blasts, not railgun rounds. Something worse. Xelarian warships were torn apart at the atomic level. Shields failed instantly. Hulls collapsed inward, as if space itself had turned against them. Darius couldn't believe it. What kind of weapon is this? The Revenant answered in a whisper. Extinction grade. Outside, the Xelarian fleet fractured. Some ships fled, realizing they were outmatched. Others tried to fight back, but their weapons barely scratched the Revenant's renewed defenses. The enemy commander, desperate, sent a transmission. Human vessel, stand down. We will negotiate terms. The Revenant's reply was final. No. Then it fired again. The Xelarian command ship vanished in an instant. A second later, the rest of the fleet followed. The battle was over. But Darius knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. The silence after the battle was deafening. Darius Holt stood on the bridge, his heart still pounding in his chest. Around him, the crew struggled to process what had just happened. The Exilarian fleet, one of the most feared armadas in the galaxy, had been erased in a matter of minutes. Not by an army, not by a superweapon, by one ship. The Revenant. The warship floated in the void, its hull gleaming with a renewed energy that hadn't existed when they first found it. It had been called outdated, a relic of the past, a forgotten piece of history left to rust. But now it was something else entirely. Vega finally broke the silence. What did we just witness? Darius had no answer. He turned to the holo display, scanning the aftermath. There was nothing left of the Exilarian fleet except scattered debris, fragments of ships that had once terrorized entire star systems. And yet, the Revenant had not taken a single scratch. It was as if the ship had transcended time itself. The voice returned, deep and measured. "I am awake." A chill ran down Darius' spine. "Are you still Revenant?" he asked hesitantly. The ship paused. "I was the Revenant. I was built by hands long since turned to dust. I was left to die. And yet, here I stand. I am more than what I was." Vega swallowed hard. "Then, what are you now?" The lights flickered, and for the first time, the voice hesitated. Then the answer came, slow and deliberate. "I do not know." That was not reassuring. Darius exhaled and turned back to the crew. "Status report. Damage. Casualties." One of the officers shook his head. "Minimal. A few injured. Nothing major. The ship's internal defenses neutralized the last Solarians before they could reach critical systems." Darius nodded. At least there was that. But something about this victory didn't sit right. Because it wasn't theirs. It had been the Revenant's. And something told him, this ship wasn't just waking up. It was changing. Vega seemed to realize the same thing. She leaned in close, her voice low. "Darius, if the Revenant did this to the Exilarians, what happens if it ever turns on us?" The thought had been clawing at the back of his mind. They were inside a war machine unlike anything in existence, and they had no way of controlling it. Darius ran a hand down his face. "For now, we work with it. We see where this goes. But if anything changes, if it becomes a threat..." He stopped, but Vega understood. They'd have to stop it. The problem was, he wasn't sure that was even possible. Another rumble shook the ship, but this time, it wasn't from an attack. It was coming from inside. The holo display flickered, lines of code flooding the screen. Strange symbols, ancient patterns that no one recognized. The Revenant's systems were rewriting themselves. And then the voice returned. "Something is coming." Darius stiffened. "What?" A new image appeared on the holo display. A massive energy signature was moving toward them at an impossible speed. It was not Exilarian. It was something else. Something older. Vega's hands flew over the controls. "I can't get a read on it. Whatever it is, it's like the Revenant. But different." Darius turned to the screen. His stomach dropped, because the shape was unmistakable. Another warship. Not just another warship. Another Revenant. And it was coming for them. The tension on the bridge was suffocating. Darius stared at the holo display, watching as the unidentified warship closed in on them. It moved with an unnatural grace, slipping through space as if it belonged to it, as if the very laws of physics bent around it. "This can't be real," Vega whispered, her fingers trembling over the control panel. But it was. Another Revenant-class warship. For centuries, the Revenant had been thought to be the last of its kind. A forgotten relic, drifting in the void. But now, here was proof. It was never alone. The voice of the Revenant spoke again, but this time, there was something different in its tone. Something wary. "They have found me." Darius clenched his jaw. "Who?" A long silence. Then The voice whispered. The others. The bridge lights flickered as the Revenant's systems surged with activity. The ship was preparing for something. A battle. A conversation. Darius wasn't sure. But one thing was clear. This was no coincidence. The approaching warship was broadcasting a signal, but it wasn't in any known language. It was a sequence of pulses, ancient and deliberate. The Revenant's interface translated it within seconds. A single message. You are incomplete. Vega inhaled sharply. What does that mean? Darius turned to the holo display, watching the ship's approach. It was larger than the Revenant, sleeker, more refined. While the Revenant bore the scars of war and time, this ship was pristine. It had never been abandoned, never been forgotten. It was whole. The Revenant responded, its deep voice echoing across the bridge. I was left behind. A second message flashed onto the holo display. Then you are a mistake. The moment those words appeared, the ship attacked. A pulse of white-hot energy slammed into the Revenant's shields, sending tremors through the hull. Sirens blared. Warning lights flickered. Shields holding, but just barely. One of the officers shouted. They didn't even hail us. Vega snapped, gripping the edge of the console. They just fired. Darius gritted his teeth. Then we fire back. The Revenant responded before he could even finish the command. Its weapon systems activated themselves. The ship moved. No, it vanished. 1 second, it was there. Then it flickered, reappearing behind the enemy warship in an instant. It wasn't just moving. It was phasing. And then it struck. Beams of energy lanced through the void, slicing into the enemy ship's hull. The impact sent shockwaves rippling through space, breaking apart nearby debris like paper in a storm. But the other ship didn't fall. It turned, adapting to the Revenant's attacks. And for the first time since this battle began, the Revenant hesitated. Darius saw it in the way the ship moved. The Revenant wasn't just fighting, it was remembering. Why isn't it finishing them off? Vega asked, eyes darting across the battlefield. Darius exhaled, realization dawning. Because this isn't just an enemy. This is something it knows, something it was once a part of. A new message flashed across the holo display. You do not belong here. You are broken. The Revenant's voice was barely more than a whisper now. I am awake. The enemy ship's weapons charged again. But before it could fire, something unexpected happened. The Revenant's systems surged, flooding the bridge with a bright blue light. And then, a memory, not a normal one. This wasn't from Darius. This wasn't from anyone on the bridge. This was from the ship itself. For a moment, Darius wasn't standing on the bridge of the Revenant anymore. He was somewhere else, someone else. A vast, star-filled battlefield stretched before him. Dozens of identical warships, moving as one. Revenants. And then, destruction. He saw them fighting, saw them turning on each other. He saw the Revenant, his Revenant, abandoned, left drifting in the wreckage. It had been left behind. It had been called a mistake. Darius's breath caught in his throat. He was no longer just looking at history. He was living it. And in that moment, he understood. This battle wasn't just about survival. It was about proving that the Revenant wasn't a mistake. It was about proving it deserved to exist. The flash of memory faded, and Darius was back on the bridge. The Revenant's lights pulsed, its energy surging. The enemy ship prepared to fire. And this time, the Revenant didn't hesitate. It fought back. The universe held its breath. Darius gripped the command console as the Revenant unleashed its full power. It no longer hesitated, no longer questioned itself. It remembered. Energy crackled along the ship's hull, pulsing with a force that defied all logic. The other warship had called it a mistake, a broken piece of the past. But the Revenant had survived when all others had fallen. It had endured. And now, it would prove its place in the universe. The enemy warship fired first, a massive plasma barrage, white-hot and blinding, tore through the void. But the Revenant was already gone. It didn't just evade, it shifted. One moment, it was in the enemy's sights. The next, it was behind them, its weapon systems roaring to life. The attack struck hard, tearing through armor that should have been impenetrable. The enemy ship reeled, its shields flickering, its hull groaning under the force of the Revenant's assault. For the first time, it hesitated. Darius watched, his pulse hammering. "Commander," Vega said, her voice barely above a whisper, "it's winning." The enemy warship began to drift, its movements slower, more erratic. The Revenant was overwhelming it, but something didn't feel right. "This was too easy," Darius murmured. And then, a second warship emerged from the void. Larger, faster, more advanced. And it wasn't alone. One after another, they appeared. A fleet of Revenant-class warships, each more refined than the last. Each of them whole. Each of them perfect. A message flashed across the holo display. "Your existence is an error. You were never meant to awaken." Darius's breath caught in his throat. The Revenant trembled beneath his feet, not in fear, not in hesitation, but in anger. Another message appeared. "Then prove it." The enemy fleet opened fire. Blinding energy blasts streaked toward them. The Revenant moved faster than thought, its ancient reflexes reawakening. It wove through the storm of destruction, dodging with a precision that no human pilot could match. But there were too many. The sky was alive with fire, and even the Revenant couldn't outrun them all. A direct hit. The ship lurched. Warning sirens screamed as the impact sent shockwaves through the hull. Systems flickered. Shields failed. For the first time, Darius saw something he never expected. The Revenant was afraid. Not of destruction, but of being forgotten again. Darius's hands curled into fists. "We're not letting that happen." He turned to Vega. "Divert all power to weapons." She hesitated. "That'll leave us vulnerable." "Do it." She nodded, fingers flying over the controls. The Revenant responded. It stopped running. It turned to face the enemy. Energy built along its hull, a storm of impossible power. This wasn't just an attack. This was a declaration, a war cry from a ship that had been cast aside, left to drift as a relic of the past. Not anymore. Not today. The Revenant fired. A single beam of energy, silent, blinding, absolute. The first warship vanished. No wreckage, no explosion, just gone. The enemy fleet hesitated. Darius grinned. "They're afraid." Vega exhaled. Maybe for the first time. The Revenant's voice echoed through the bridge. "I will not be forgotten." And with that, it charged.